A December evening in Montgomery, Alabama. The air is cool, the streets half asleep. A tired seamstress named Rosa Parks boards a bus after a long day's work. No cameras, no crowd. No prophecy carved into stone. Just a woman, a seat, and a moment waiting to change history. But what unfolded next would ignite one of the most defining revolutions in modern civilization. Not a revolution of weapons or armies, but a revolution of dignity. Rosa sat down in the colored section. The bus filled. White passengers boarded. The driver looked back and demanded, "You need to move." Rosa didn't shout. She didn't fight. She simply said, "No." And in that single word, quiet, calm, yet immovable, the world shifted. That no was not defiance for defiance's sake. It was a declaration, an ancient human truth echoing from every age of oppression, that no law, no custom, no fear could erase a person's inherent worth. History often glorifies battles fought with swords, but this battle began in silence. A silence more thunderous than war drums. A silence that challenged centuries of cruelty and forced a nation to look into the mirror of its own conscience. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, she wasn't just disobeying a bus driver, she was disobeying a system designed to humiliate, to dehumanize, and to divide. And in that act, history witnessed something eternal that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply sits and refuses to move. The long arc of justice, David Christian once said that to understand any moment in history, you must stretch your vision from the beginning of time to the present. So let's widen the lens. Segregation was not an isolated injustice. It was a relic of a much deeper, older pattern in human history, the tendency of societies to build hierarchies of us and them. From caste systems to empires, from colonial conquest to industrial inequality, human history has always balanced on that fragile line between power and principle. Rosa's cracked that balance wide open. The Montgomery Bus Boycott that followed was not just a protest. It was a rehearsal for moral evolution. For 381 days, tens of thousands of African Americans refused to ride the buses of Montgomery. They walked miles to work. They organized carpools. They endured arrests, threats, and violence, all for a single purpose: to stand upright in a system that told them to bow. And that endurance, that collective defiance, became the seed of a new era. An era we call the civil rights movement. The universe bends toward the brave. Rosa's courage inspired Martin Luther King Jr. Then a young preacher, barely in his mid-20s, to rise as the voice of a generation. He would later say, "When the history books are written, someone will have to say that there lived a people who had the courage to stand up for their rights." But courage is contagious. The spark Rosa lit spread beyond Montgomery, through the American South, across the ocean, into movements of freedom around the world. In the deep structure of history, what I, David Christian, call the big history, Small actions ripple through vast systems. The same way gravity binds galaxies, moral acts bind civilizations. Rosa Parks' quiet defiance became a gravitational event, pulling the moral center of the 20th century toward justice. This is how civilizations shift, not always with the might of kings, but through the conscience of ordinary individuals. The price of dignity, but make no mistake, dignity has a cost. Rosa Parks was fired from her job. Her husband faced constant harassment. She was blacklisted from local employment. For years, she lived in the shadows of the very movement she helped ignite. While the world celebrated her name, Rosa endured poverty and illness. And yet she never spoke of regret, because true revolutionaries do not act for applause. They act for alignment with something greater than themselves. She said, "I would like to be remembered as a person who wanted to be free, so other people would also be free." A freedom in her eyes was not an individual privilege. It was a shared human obligation. Rosa Parks was not seeking to sit for comfort. She was sitting for history, the hidden architecture of change, to truly grasp the power of Rosa's act. We must understand something: deeper change in human societies often begins invisibly. In the architecture of everyday life, buses, schools, restaurants, these were not merely public spaces. They were ritual spaces, places where social hierarchy was enforced through repetition. Segregation wasn't just physical, it was psychological conditioning. By refusing to move, Rosa interrupted that ritual. She broke the spell. It's what historians call a micro-rebellion, a single act that redefines the boundaries of what's acceptable. And from that micro-rebellion came a macro transformation, the dismantling of legalized segregation across America. That's the irony of history. The mightiest empires fall, the grandest revolutions rise, and yet the turning point often hides in the smallest act of human will. The bus stopped, but the movement didn't. When Rosa Parks was arrested, the photograph of her fingerprinted hand became a symbol, not of crime, but of conscience. It spread across newspapers, church bulletins, and dinner tables. It whispered to millions, "If she can stand firm sitting down, what excuse do I have?" And so, the Montgomery Bus Boycott was born, not through violence, but through unity, the most dangerous weapon in the hands of the oppressed. For 381 relentless days, people walked. Through storms, through fatigue, through fear. Teachers, maids, ministers, janitors, an entire community carried a movement on foot. Each step they took was a sermon. Each refusal to ride was a declaration: we will not finance our humiliation. The buses rolled empty. The economy bled. The city felt the tremors of a new kind of revolution, one driven not by destruction, but by discipline. The birth of a leader. Out of this fire, a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. emerged, not born into power, but forged by purpose. He spoke not just of civil rights, but of moral order, of the eternal contract between justice and humanity. King once said, The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But here's the truth, it doesn't bend on its own. It bends when ordinary people, like Rosa, place their hands upon it and pull. The boycott didn't just challenge bus companies. It challenged the entire moral infrastructure of a nation. America was forced to choose between comfort and conscience, between habit and humanity. And for the first time, the world was watching. The world takes notice from Africa to Asia, from Europe to Latin America. The story of Rosa Parks reached the ears of millions living under their own chains. In South Africa, young activists whispered her name as apartheid tightened its grip. In India, where Gandhi's echoes still lingered, people saw in her the same truth Gandhi had taught, that non-violence is not weakness, but strength refined through pain. In Britain, France, and across Europe, intellectuals debated the morality of racial segregation, forced to confront their own colonial legacies. A bus in Montgomery had become a mirror to the world, because the story of Rosa Parks was not just an American story. It was a human story, written in every era where someone has been told to know their place. The anatomy of change in the language of big history. What happened in Montgomery was a threshold event, a point after which the world could never go back to what it was before. Civilizations evolve through thresholds. The mastery of fire, the invention of writing, the birth of agriculture, the rise of empires, and then millennia later, a woman sits still, and the idea of equality crosses its next great threshold. History moved forward that day, not through machines or discoveries, but through moral awakening. That's the real power of history. It doesn't just tell us what happened. It tells us what's possible. The science of moral evolution, if we examine history scientifically, patterns emerge. Every major leap in human development has been triggered by one principal cooperation beyond tribe. Tribes became villages. Villages became nations. And now, through acts like Rosa's, nations were being asked to become consciences. Her defiance was the next step in that evolutionary chain, the expansion of empathy itself. For thousands of years, humans had drawn circles around who was worthy of dignity. First family, then clan, then race, then religion. Rosa Parks helped redraw that circle, not as a boundary, but as a horizon. The moral mathematics of history. Let's speak plainly. The cost of moral progress is always paid by those least able to afford it. Rosa paid that price. But her act yielded exponential returns. Each generation that followed, from the March on Washington to the protests of today, walks on the ground she helped clear. Because every act of conscience has a compounding effect. When one person resists injustice, they increase the moral capital of the species. And that, perhaps, is humanity's most profound innovation. Not the wheel, not the atom, not the internet, but the capacity to say no when yes would be easier. That is the mathematics of moral evolution. One act of defiance can shift the trajectory of millions. beyond the bus, a universal legacy. In later years, Rosa Parks became a quiet symbol of dignity around the world. She wasn't loud. She didn't seek fame. But she became the North Star of civil disobedience. A reminder that peace is not passive. When Nelson Mandela spoke of freedom, he mentioned her. When Malala Yousafzai fought for girls' education, she echoed the same spirit. When modern protesters sit in silent defiance, they sit in her shadow. Rosa's seat was not just a place on a bus. It was a pillar of conscience on which future generations would rise. And that's the beauty of history. Once a moral precedent is set, it cannot be undone. The boycotts ended. The buses were desegregated. The courts ruled that the old order had fallen. But Rosa Parks knew something deeper. The victory was legal, not yet moral. Because the architecture of racism wasn't just built into law, it was built into habit, into imagination, into the invisible systems that teach one person to look down on another. And that battle, the war for perception, would take generations. Rosa never stopped fighting. She marched, she spoke. She organized voter drives, she mentored the youth. She became a living bridge between past and future, between the Montgomery of 1955 and the America of today. And in her quiet strength, we see the anatomy of real revolution, not rage, not revenge, but resolve. The eternal pattern of resistance. Look back across time, every era, every continent, every culture. The story repeats. When power grows blind, someone opens their eyes. When silence becomes normal, someone speaks. When conformity becomes culture, someone stands apart. From Socrates in ancient Athens to Joan of Arc in France, from Gandhi in India to Rosa Parks in Montgomery. The current of history flows not through empires, but through individuals who refuse to yield. And yet, each of them carried a truth larger than themselves. That resistance is not chaos, it's conscience in motion. The cosmic view of courage. Let's zoom out, far beyond buses, beyond borders, beyond even human history. Imagine the 13.8 billion year timeline of the universe itself, from the birth of stars to the rise of civilizations. In that entire cosmic story, consciousness evolved to a point where a single human being could say, "This is wrong." That moment, that act of moral reasoning, is as remarkable as the creation of life itself. Because the universe, through us, learned to care. Rosa Parks didn't just make history. She expressed the deepest law of evolution, that survival is not enough. Meaning matters. Justice matters. The ripple through time after her arrest, after the boycott, after the marches. Rosa Parks grew older but never smaller. She received awards, medals, global recognition, but she wore them with the humility of someone who knew the work was never done. When she passed away in 2005, her coffin lay in honor in the US, Capitol Rotunda, the first woman in American history to receive that tribute. Tens of thousands stood in line in silence, as if to say thank you to the woman who had taught the world how to sit with purpose. And that day, As her casket rested beneath the dome built by slaves, the full symmetry of history revealed itself. The system she once defied now bowed its head before her. The deeper lesson: we often think of history as a story of kings and wars. But Rosa Parks reminds us, history is also the story of conscience, of people who changed the world not because they had power, but because they had clarity. When Rosa sat on that bus, she didn't know the headlines she would make, the marches she would inspire, or the laws she would change. She just knew what her soul could no longer tolerate. And that's the threshold every society eventually reaches. The point where obedience becomes betrayal and silence becomes sin. Rosa Parks was not the first to sit, but she was the first whose stillness moved a nation. The human thread in big history. We study patterns, how complexity emerges from simplicity, how stars give birth to worlds, how life learns to think. And if you trace that thread all the way to Rosa Parks, you'll find the same principle. Small things create great transformations. A particle becomes an atom becomes a star becomes a world. A single act of courage becomes a civilizational shift. That's the grandeur of her legacy. She showed that moral gravity is real. That one person, aligned with truth, can pull the entire orbit of history toward justice. The final stanza, when we ask, what did Rosa Parks really do? The answer is simple and infinite. She reminded humanity that dignity is not negotiable. That obedience to injustice is the slow death of civilization. And that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to stay exactly where you are. Because history doesn't always belong to those who move. Sometimes it belongs to those who refuse. Standing ovation moment. So tonight, if you ever doubt your power, remember this. The woman who changed the course of modern history didn't have an army. She didn't have wealth, influence, or a microphone. She had a seat and the courage to stay in it. Her no still echoes in classrooms, in protests, in hearts that refuse to surrender to silence. And as long as that echo lives, the bus of history keeps moving forward. One seat, one stand, one conscience at a time. Rosa Parks did not just sit for herself. She sat for the world.